Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this short session for an hour. We're going to talk about looking at proactive accountability during a crisis for employees. And obviously it's timely, just as we are in the current situation with COVID. So whether you're in lockdown or not, I guess we're still going through some degree of crises. So let's talk about that, and let's talk a little bit about what you might be able to do and not do in those sort of circumstances. So what I'll do is I'll share my screen and we'll get underway. Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, Tim Baker's my name, so welcome. And you can see I write books. I've written several books. I present in workshops. I also do platform speaking. I do executive coaching and play rugby in the Golden Oldies in my spare time here in Brisbane. So welcome, everyone. Look forward to working with you. If you've got any comments or questions you'd like to pose, please just put them in the chat box. I'll answer them as soon as I can, but I won't be leaving a sort of a 5-minute pause at the end for questions. So just as soon as you think of something or you want to add something to the conversation, go ahead and do that in the chat box. Okay. So I think one of the key issues here that I want to deal with is this, and in a crisis, people pass the accountability on to their managers. I mean, even when we're not in a crisis, it's true, isn't it, that employees will pass the accountability back to you if you're the manager. So the question is, how can I make my team members more accountable? That's the question. So we're going to look at difficult situations and crises, but the truth is, these things are applicable, of course, right across the board in terms of getting more accountability from people. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I term as the proactive paradox and what that means, and talk about that in relation to my new book. And then, of course, I'm going to share with you some strategies for proactive accountability. So some of the things you should do and perhaps some of the things you shouldn't do. And I'll finish up with a special offer at the end. So that'll take us through for a short time of 30 minutes. So paradoxes, we hear them all the time, and paradoxes are very much a process of what comes first, the chicken or the egg. And sometimes it's hard to work out which comes first. So in this case, the proactive paradox is a paradox between the manager and the staff member or the team member, and we'll have a look at that in some way here. You can see here that how I explain this, and it's a pretty simple process, is that you as the leader initially, in most cases, want your employees to show initiative. And when I say show initiative, I mean prudent initiative, the right sort of initiative, to use their independent judgment in the right way. So obviously that's what you want to start with. Most managers would say that that's what they're after. Now, on the other hand, of course, your team members actually want to exercise autonomy and initiative as well. So at the very start, at the outset, if you like, we have a situation where you and your team members are on exactly the same page. So no problem. So we're both there. We both want to be either exercising or seeing evidence of exercising initiative. So what happens is that what you explain to your team members, perhaps in a team meeting or in a corridor conversation, you explain to them that you want them to show initiative in the right circumstances. So you make that perfectly clear. And what happens after that, when you make that statement, the team members might be sitting there a little bit skeptical about that and think to themselves, well, hang on a minute, the other day you did this and maybe you shouldn't have. So they're a little bit skeptical about your proclamation. And what they do is they sit on their hands and they don't get engaged in proactive activity. Now, what happens, of course, is you notice this. And so there's a vacuum between what you were expecting and what you wanted to stand back from. And so what you do is you go in and you do those things that you were hoping that employees would do. And you see, because the vacuum's there, you've got to fill it. And of course, when you fill that vacuum, what happens is your team members sit there and go, aha, I knew my leader didn't really want me to show my initiative. I knew my leader didn't want me to be, to show initiative and be proactive. And so it reinforces the view that you were never really interested in being, in having us be proactive, you see. So this is this paradox. And of course, it's a breakdown of communication, which is ultimately what it is. So the three stages of that, of course, are you have agreement. So both are on the same page. You both are willing and want the other to either step back and allow them to show initiative, or you want them to show initiative. What happens then is the skepticism happens. The skepticism occurs because perhaps they've seen you in the past getting involved in issues that they think that they could possibly have managed. And then, of course, when they see you jumping in and doing those things, it confirms in their mind that they really shouldn't be showing their initiative. And of course, what that means is that they don't take any accountability. So that's what I call the proactive paradox. So, and of course, it happens in all industries. It doesn't matter what industries there are. I see it all the time. So there are really basically four strategies to break the proactive paradox. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these because today we're going to look at the final one, which is proactive accountability. So I won't touch on the other three, but I wanted to talk about one strategy today. And this is particularly relevant in situations that emerge that might be a crisis or unethical behavior in the workplace. This is when we want people to actually exercise proactive accountability. The big difference between proactive accountability and the other three is that what I'll do is I'll give you a definition of that. And here is a definition. So if we're looking at proactive accountability, it's the strategy of proactive accountability is based on an understanding that your team members can exercise their initiative and judgment in certain situations. All right, so those are very clear situations. But the catch is they can only do so, and if they do so, that it can only be done at their own risk. So in other words, if I jump in and I act proactively, then I must accept that if it doesn't go well, then I'm going to be in the firing line. So this is a very relevant strategy in very bureaucratic and organisations, perhaps government agencies and so forth, where there's a limited capacity to act proactively. Now, if you think about a crisis or you think about unethical behaviour, these are examples where you would actually want people to act proactively. But of course, there's a risk attached with those things. And therefore, sometimes people don't act proactively in those circumstances because they're concerned that it might come back to bite them. So that's what proactive accountability is, which is the fourth strategy, breaking that proactive paradox. So I wanted to look at two issues here, and I've sort of flagged those. And the first issue is unethical behaviour. Now, most organisations have got protocols in place for that, but the evidence is clear that a lot of people are not prepared to call out unethical behaviour, not because they don't think it's appropriate, or not because they think it's appropriate. It's really the risk associated with it, because if I call out, say, my manager for being unethical or demonstrating unethical behaviour, that might come back to bite me in terms of my career. And so, unfortunately, what you find is no matter how good the policies are, people sometimes will turn a blind eye because they don't want to be proactively accountable in that situation. And of course, the other familiar one is a crisis. Now, when a crisis occurs, there's always going to be a risk to act autonomously without checking with the manager, because it's a unique situation. And often the onus of accountability is left with the manager. But of course, in a crisis, we actually expect people to act with initiative, because sometimes that is important and has to happen. But again, an employee may feel that there's some risk and then they play it safe. And as a result of that, of course, the crisis can be worsened as a result. So we'll look at these two examples in our session this morning. Let's first of all look at the issue of unethical behavior. Now, the research shows that, and I've just summarized the research here. Of course, I'm not going to sort of draw, I'm not going to quote all of the research, but basically, why don't employees report unethical behavior? Now, of course, in some cases they do, and I think it's becoming more prevalent, and that's great. But there's essentially 4 reasons for that. I mean, the first reason is it might be damaging to my career. In other words, whoever it is might be in a position of power, and as a result of that, they might take it out on me because I'm the one that was the whistleblower. So that's one very real reason that people don't act proactively, in those circumstances. And another reason is it could result in making the offender harder to work with, which is kind of similar to the first one. In other words, if it's my manager and my manager becomes aware that I'm reporting them for unethical behavior, then I probably will have to work with them from here on in. So perhaps we should just let sleeping dogs lie and not get engaged in me reporting that behavior. Another possibility, and that's probably a more disturbing possibility, is that if I make a complaint about something or someone's behavior, it may not be taken seriously. And remember, this is the research from employees. So the questions were around, why won't you report unethical behavior? So one of those was that maybe if I did report it, it wouldn't be taken seriously. Now, that's a problem, because when unethical behavior is reported, you would expect that people would do some sort of due diligence and investigation into it, regardless of what it might be. But some employees are very skeptical about that and think, well, I won't bother to do that because, frankly, I don't think that they will believe me, or, it'll be someone else's opinion over mine. Now, the fourth reason is that people are uncertain about how to raise the matter. And that might mean, who do I talk to, or how do I go about it? And so if I'm not sure who I should talk to or how I should go about it, then perhaps what I should do is just say nothing and just get on with it. So all of these are a deterrence to proactive accountability. Now, the key for us, of course, is to try to minimize these as much as we can so that people will be prepared to jump forward, because obviously if people don't step forward, then unethical behavior flourishes, and it's not a good thing for the organization and the culture. And we've seen plenty of examples of that. If you look at Enron during the financial crisis, there was a lot of unethical behavior obviously going on, but people weren't prepared to report it for probably a variety of the reasons that you've got in front of you. And so it wasn't until the aftermath of that it was very obvious that there was considerable unethical behavior going on in that organization. So really, I think what I would ask you to do is to look at your framework in your organization. Now, you may not have complete authority over this, but it is important to understand that there are 4 key things that are critically important in order to promote proactive accountability to report unethical behavior. First of all, you need to have a code of ethics. In other words, a statement about what appropriate behavior is or what we stand for. Now, of course, we know that these are plaques on the wall, and sometimes people walk past them every day and they don't pay much attention, but we actually need a code of ethics. Now, I think personally, we should get our organizations involved in that, and it shouldn't be done by a couple of managers behind closed doors. I think the code of ethics is something that everyone should have a say in. I'm sure you'd agree. So that's the baseline. That is the foundation of ethical behavior in organizations. So that gives us something to measure behavior against. What we also need to do, of course, is develop a very rigorous protocol. Now, the protocol is, of course, how we might go about reporting unethical behavior. So we need to give employees confidence that this is a good system, that it won't be open to manipulation, that if I do make a complaint, I will be listened to. Now, it may be that obviously the complaint might be, it may not be necessarily founded, but it will be listened to. So one of the obvious things in a protocol is you need a so-called independent person who will take that complaint. Now, that's interesting because a lot of organizations now are outsourcing that to specialized services where people can actually look at that complaint one step removed from the organization. Now, the strength of that, of course, is that they are one step removed from the organization. The weakness of that, of course, being one step removed, they may not understand the intricacies and how the organization operates or indeed its culture. Now, the other thing we need to do is we need to enable employees to understand how this system works. And ultimately, what that requires is pretty much training. We need to train people not only why ethical behavior is critically important, but also their responsibility when they might witness unethical behavior and how they might go about reporting that in a way that is constructive. So obviously, if you don't train your team on how to do that, then that's going to lead to some concerns about whether or not I should actually report behavior like that. Now, the fourth pillar of this framework is that the whole code of ethics should be reviewed on a regular basis. And I find this is a big fault in lots of organizations. It often happens after a major event. But I think it's something that should be ongoing, and it should be something that is open to employees to be engaged in, because obviously it makes sense. If you've got team members engaged in developing that code, then clearly they will have some ownership over that. And of course, if they witness behavior that is, contrary to that code, they may well be more likely to make a comment in those circumstances or to put in to file a complaint or a grievance. So it's very important to get all of this right. And of course, even when you do get it right, the four issues I explained to you before may not always occur. But what I'm suggesting to you is one of the ways to encourage proactive behavior around unethical conduct is by making sure that you've got a good framework in place, and that will make a big difference. Now, let's look at crises. Now, crises, of course, come out of the blue. You don't expect them because obviously if you did, you'd be able to prepare for them, and they occur all the time. And I might say that they will continue to occur, and we just need employees to be able to act proactively, accountably when they do occur. Now, let's just look at 8 things that you need to do in order to encourage people to step forward in a crisis and to back their own judgment. So the first thing is, I often find that when a crisis occurs, and think about your own industry, I'm sure you can think of crises that impact on your business or organization. But often what happens is that the leader will often try to control the crisis with the normal operating procedures. Now, this is a big mistake because a crisis is a unique event usually, and because it's certainly the event is unique. Crises themselves aren't per se unique, but the crisis itself is unique. So therefore, using normal operating procedures is not the right way to go. So you might need to suspend some of those during a crisis. So, because obviously if you're the custodian for an operating system and you want to continue it, then you're sending a signal that it's business as usual. Now, I'll just move from left to right here. This phenomenon is called threat rigidity. So what happens, and what scholars call this, is threat rigidity. So when a threat occurs in a workplace, often what happens is our behavior becomes very rigid. In other words, we stick to systems, processes, and procedures that we're used to. We try to hide behind those because the threat is there, and we become more rigid in how we go about things. So what you need to do as a leader is suspend some of those systems, processes, and procedures for the duration of that crisis. Employees respond by erecting walls around their tasks. So what will often happen is that when people are under pressure, what they do is they revert back to what they're familiar with, which of course is their work, their job, and so forth. And what you need to do as a leader is actually do the opposite. You need to open up cross-functional communication channels. So, for example, that might mean organising a meeting with a number of people across various departments who are engaged in this crisis, rather than try and sort of contain it within one team. So cross-functional communication is absolutely vital. Otherwise, what happens is people just get caught up in their silo and don't consider, their own responsibilities in this regard. Now, if leaders are agile in times of crises, others will follow. So your example during a crisis is critically important. So that means that you need to be flexible in the way you go about your business during a crisis. You need not just be stuck to, as I said earlier, your own systems and processes. You need to be open to and willing to change your opinion or your approach depending on the circumstances that are in front of you. Now, if you do that, of course, you're sending a signal to your team that it's perfectly legitimate for you to do the same thing. All right, so there's 4 now. On the bottom line there, engaging the team is important too. So a lot of times leaders tend to take all this on themselves and become completely accountable. Now, of course, you're ultimately accountable for what happens in your area, but you need to take your team with you. And what that actually means is that during times of crisis, you need to engage your team as much as possible. All right, so these meetings don't have to be long meetings, but they still need to happen. And as I said earlier, it might well be worth extending those meetings beyond just your team to other people in the organisation who are impacted by the crisis. So that is important. And of course, during those meetings, you need to explain people's roles and responsibilities during that crisis, which would probably be quite different to what it would be under normal circumstances. So collaborative leaders remind people that achieving the right outcome takes priority over faithfully adhering to the status quo. So what the leader's role here is really to explain the big picture. In other words, what is the end result we're looking for out of this situation that we're dealing with? And what you're doing by implication, by articulating the ideal outcome, is you're saying to your team members that the normal rules of engagement are suspended until such time as we can achieve the ideal outcome. So if your team members know what the ideal outcome is, and all of them are on the same page, then that gives them a license to act autonomously if they believe that it's going to help achieve the ideal outcome. So it's always about an end game here. Also, encouraging people to ask naive questions and constructively challenging strategies is important as well, because some people might be sitting there wondering what to do, and they might be afraid to ask the question. Now, that of course, is not a good place to be. So you actually want to encourage people to ask those questions when you're meeting with them, either one-on-one in a group. And also the other side of it, and of course this very much depends on your personality as a leader, you should really invite constructive criticism of your strategies. So in other words, you know, the old saying, you know, many heads are better than one. You need to have other people there to think about the contingencies of what is suggested as a way forward. So you actually try to engage your team in a solution. And if you can engage your team in a solution, they're likely to be able to respond more autonomously because they're confident about the strategy. And finally, it's not only your immediate team that you need to communicate with in a crisis. So one of the things you need to do is to think beyond your team and think about some of your stakeholders and how this crisis, whatever it might be, is actually impacting on their capacity to do their work. So think that through, because obviously, you know, a crisis normally doesn't just affect one team or a group of individuals. It's normally much bigger than that. And your job is to consider the stakeholders and who they are engaged in that process. So there's 9 things I strongly suggest you do. All right, so folks, next week, and of course many of you would know, but if you don't know, every Friday at approximately 10 o'clock, certainly sometime in the morning, I have one of these short, sharp sessions. I take a snippet from one of my books and I talk about this. And of course, you can find out more from the book. But next week, I'm going to talk about improving performance by rethinking job design, which is a very interesting topic and very topical, I think, coming out of COVID. And I'm going to give you a few tips. I'm going to talk specifically about job crafting and what it is and how it can impact on your own team and why it's so important to job craft. So we're going to talk about that next Friday on the 20th from 10 a.m. And you can see at the bottom, you've got a link there. So you're going to receive a copy of these slides because you attended. And all you've got to do is click on that link and in you go, and you can register for next Friday's event. In fact, you can register for any of the events that come up on the Friday. And the final thing is just a quick plug for my latest book, Breaking the Proactive Paradox, Maximizing Performance Through Empowerment. This book will be available, in the next couple of months. And what if you'd like to grab a copy, then you can do so at the reduced rate. So the recommended retail price is $40 plus postage. And I'm offering the book for you today at $30. And what that means is by pre-ordering it, I'll sign it for you as soon as it's hot off the press, and I'll send it out to you for that discounted rate. So if you'd like to take advantage of that, all you've got to do is send me an email by the close of business today. Just a quick email, there it is, and just say I'd like a copy of the book, and I will make that happen for you. And we can organize that for you, and I'll send out a signed copy when it comes out hot off the press. So folks, that's it from me. I'll just stop sharing for the time being. Thank you very much. I appreciate your support for the work that I do, and I'd love to see you attend some of our other sessions if you haven't already. So thank you very much, and have a wonderful weekend, a restful weekend, and recharge your batteries for the next week. Thanks everyone, all the best, and goodbye.